Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. A question came in last week from Joe Hogan, which was about the risk of instability from a constitutional crisis related to the November presidential elections. And this has been a topic for a lot of people because you have a couple confluence factors. You have a president who kind of shoots from the hip a lot, makes a lot of pronouncements, says a lot of things. You have a global pandemic, which makes being in person dangerous. You have states that have different viewpoints on this pandemic. You have a cultural split, a red and blue divide have emerged. So all of these things, it's a presidential election year, and in a presidential election year, everything is going to be about those politics and elections. So I didn't want to get too much into the instability yet, because I think that's jumping ahead. I'll get into it eventually, but what I wanted to lay down is just give people some context and some scenarios about how do presidential elections actually work in terms of scenarios that might be affected by the pandemic. So I wanted to go through what those are, because a lot of people they know that we vote and they know that the president, or they might know there's an electoral college, and sometimes that reflects popular votes or not. But when it comes to the pandemic and what decisions might be made, there's some important things to understand as context for these scenarios. So the first thing that's really important, even though it's a federal election, we're voting for the president, we're voting for the House of Representatives, we're voting for Senate, every state is in charge of its own elections. This goes back to the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, right? Each state determines how they're going to run their elections, and each state determines how they're going to appoint their electors. This is federalism. Again, the US is very different as a country from this federalism concept, where the national government doesn't have all the power. And this, when it comes to, even though it's a federal election, the states, each state by state, has the authority. So right off the bat, the president has zero constitutional authority to determine what a state's going to do. And this would be any president. This would be whether it's President Trump or President Obama or President Bush or President Clinton. No president has the ability to tell a state what to do when it comes to their elections. This is a very fundamental thing in the Constitution. When it comes to the pandemic, too, states have constitutions and laws that they have to abide by. So a state governor, we said the president can't just by whim tell a state it can't vote. Governors in states have wide emergency powers, but when it comes to elections in states, they're also limited. And we saw this very dramatically recently in a pandemic-related case where Wisconsin was trying to delay a presidential primary. Again, similar scenario, federal type of election, but state, the governor tried to delay the presidential primary, and there was a lawsuit between the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee to force the primary to be held open. And what both the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is a little bit partisan, so maybe we put that to the side, but also the US Supreme Court found, is that there has to be an incredibly compelling reason to delay an election. The state itself the governor can't just by whim say, well, the election is going to be delayed. Now, ironically, this lawsuit or court case was it was vilified by Democrats because they felt, hey, we're being forced to go out in a primary and expose ourselves during a pandemic. But this case is now precedent, and it goes in the face of any of these scenarios where the president might say, we're going to delay votes, or we're going to change votes, or we're going to alter November elections. This is now the law of the land. The law of the land is you couldn't move from November, the presidential election on November 3rd. You can't move it to another date or delay it or something like that because you're the president. And not only does the president not have that power, to order the states, now there's settled precedent that the Supreme Court doesn't even think governors have that power. So we're having an election on November 3rd. Now, there's the question of absentee ballots and provisional voting and all that stuff. Remember, states set their own election terms. So if a state wants to go ahead with the election and they mail out a bunch of requests for absentee ballots and people request absentee ballots, some states already vote primarily by mail. I mean, Washington, I think, is one example. The states may choose to use different procedures for voting, and I think there's good ways and bad ways of doing it. Most of the states now, they're not sending out absentee ballots. It's a very bad idea to just send absentee ballots to everyone, because 2/3 of the country doesn't vote, and those ballots that just get sent out to people who don't vote Maybe some of them want to vote, but it's hard. So let's say they get to vote, and that's good. But there's still going to be some people who just don't vote. They don't like the candidates. They don't have the choices. They just don't concern. And those lingering absentee ballots, if you just send them out to everyone, there's what's called third-party harvesting. There's pay for absentee ballots. There's a real risk of those votes getting in the wrong hands. But I don't think any state's just mailing out absentee ballots for everyone. What they're doing is mailing, do you want an absentee? It's a request form. And a request form, you have to provide proof of ID, you have to provide a signature match, you have to do all the documentation as if you were at a voting station, and then that person gets an absentee ballot, and that's a perfectly fine. But so there's scenario one is the president doesn't look like the president will be able to delay the vote at all. But let's say hypothetically that certain states decided to go along with the president's idea and say, we're not holding our vote. Well, this is where it gets into a weird constraining situation in that the Constitution doesn't have a lot of leeway on timelines. All the states are independently putting together their electors. Those electors have to meet on December 14th, 2020. It's in the Constitution. That is not an alterable date unless you have an amendment. So December 14th, the electors that are picked by the states are meeting in that state. And the Constitution specifies that all electors have to vote at the same time. So you've got some time. You have from November 3rd till December 14th. And by December 14th, you need to show up with your electors at that electoral college, or your vote's not going to be counted. So let's say some states that are red states decide along with the president to delay the election or to not hold the election. Well, that's okay. They won't be able to pick electors. They won't be able to send electors, and their electors won't be at the convention. The convention does not require, the electoral college when it meets, doesn't require every state to show up. It requires a majority of the electoral votes to go for any presidential candidate. So if a bunch of states decided not to hold elections, they might be able to lower that amount so no one could get a majority. Well, okay, let's say that happens. That's probably, we're now in the land of almost pure speculative fantasy, but let's game it out. If the College of Electors does not pick a president and vice president by majority of the available votes, then it goes to the House, and it goes to the House and the Senate almost immediately. I mean, so remember, we're voting in November for new House and Senate, but those folks won't be sworn in until the first or second week in January. I think it's like the 7th or the 13th. So the current House and Senate will receive who becomes president. If the electoral college can't decide by majority, it immediately goes to the House and the Senate. And this way it kind of splits. The House will determine the president, and the only two choices or three choices they can pick from are the highest three vote receivers in the nation. So they can't just pick anyone. They have to pick one of the three who receive the highest votes. The Senate picks the vice president, and I think they can pick from a broader list. So right now, House picks president, Senate picks vice president. Well, if you know how things are split, the House is heavily Democratic right now. But plot twist, edge of your seats, plot twist, the House doesn't vote by members. If the House is voting on the president from an electoral college, it votes by state. Each state committee gets together and has to decide who they're going to nominate as a president. And so that is a majority of 26 states. So you'd have to look, and I haven't been able to look through how the states roll up, but the House of Representatives, let's say there's a majority Republican delegations at 27 states. Well, there may be a scenario where they could elect a president. I don't know how it splits right now. The Senate, however, is individual members, and they each vote individually. And with Romney out there not really liking the president, you've got a potentially 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans, with the swing vote being Romney and maybe a few of these other GOPs. So let's say that, that's really where it ends. But let's say in the really fantastical scenario that there is no president picked from that thing, they're voting and revoting because they vote until they do it. So hypothetically, they could be voting consistently and not get a valid vote. The president's term ends on January 20th, right? That's in the Constitution. So this president ends his term on January 20th. And at any point where a president is not available to do his duties, well, it goes to the vice president. Well, guess what? The vice president's term ended 20th of January as well. And the presidential succession law means that the Speaker of the House. Now, by the 20th of January, the Speaker of the House is going to be whoever the House votes on when they all get sat and sworn in January. I think it's January 6th or 7th. So it happens early in January. And Probably it's going to be Speaker Pelosi again if the Democrats win the House. If the Republicans win the House, I don't know who is the current majority leader. I want to say Scalise or something like that. But anyways, there will be, whoever that House Speaker of the House will becomes president, acting president. They don't become permanent president. They don't hold the office forever, but they become the acting president until all this stuff sorts out. So, I mean, we're talking about, when we talk about instability, you have a series of cascading scenarios. One, the president can declare that voting is not going to happen on November 3rd. States are free to ignore that. There's no requirement. That's just going to be like when he declared he would, he would determine when they reopened or not, and the state said, go pound some sand. That's one scenario for instability. A second scenario for instability is some states decide not to vote. They then don't send their electors, and then the Electoral College meets and gives a majority to someone else. Well, you kind of shot yourself in the foot there, but you reap what you sow. But that would create instability. It would create a sense of illegitimacy. Our states didn't get to vote. We didn't get a say. Let's say the Electoral College can't make a majority because so many states decide not to vote. You have another part of instability, massive instability at this point when it goes to the House and the Senate. And remember, Congress is one of the least liked institutions in the country right now. So even though there's a constitutional provision that the House and the Senate get to decide, that would be an extremely partisan, extremely bitter, and you have a risk of instability there. Do any of these scenarios, and the final one is, let's say there's no president or vice president by the 20th and it defaults to Speaker of the House. That's another source of instability. So you have a series of potential opportunities, let's call them, for instability, but all of these are pretty far-fetched. I think the Republicans are not going to want to entertain this scenario where they don't get to bring electors to the Electoral College. I think a lot of this discussion of delaying the vote or things like that is probably not going to materialize. The much bigger concern is state level suppression of the vote. So suppression is different than delaying. Suppression is where you institute state level actions that make it harder to vote, make access to minority voters more difficult, close down polling stations. There's a lot of risk of that in there. And some of those could be attempted with pandemic rationales. There would be, for safety, we're going to shut down polling districts just in Black neighborhoods. Well, we know from Republican National Committee versus Democratic National Committee, and in the state of Wisconsin, at least, it was very difficult. Using the pandemic as an excuse for that sort of thing has a huge uphill battle. That doesn't mean there's lots of other, we've been doing this. There's been discussions of voter suppression and the various tactics. This is not something new. So there's a lot of tricks in the bag, unfortunately, that could be used. I think that's a much higher risk, but that's a risk we've been dealing with now for decades. It's not new. We maintain it. And so I don't see a large instability risk yet. You may have some protesters out, doing whatever, but I don't see a huge constitutional crisis other than the president himself deciding perhaps, there's always a risk that a candidate doesn't accept the election results, but generally the momentum is going to leave. The way the US system is, it doesn't have to wait for the candidate to accept the results. There are a series of gates put in place that will move past that candidate's thoughts and prayers pretty quickly and get to a point where a resolution is made, and we have a president or acting president. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.